Our next speaker then is Dr. Mark Rosegrant. He's the director of the Environmental and Production Technology Division of the International Food Policy Research Institute. He holds a PhD in public policy from the University of Michigan and has extensive experience in agricultural research and policy analysis and economic development with an emphasis on water resources and other critical natural resource and agricultural policy issues as they impact food security, rural livelihoods, and environmental sustainability. And he's won numerous awards and is a fellow of the American Association of the Advancement of Science and of the Agricultural and Applied Economics Association. So the title of his talk this afternoon is Global Prospects for Livestock Production, Consumption and Prices and Policies for Improved Sustainability. What'd you do with the...
Yeah, here it is.
Okay.
Thanks very much. Well, I'm a victim of one of these, being the third person on the same topic, so Mario and Roger have introduced several of the points I want to make, but let me see if I can add some value too. So what I want to talk about is just briefly introduce the transformation of the livestock sector globally and how that impacts on sustainability of the sector. Then sort of the body of my talk is going to be looking at the most recent baseline projections for the livestock sector from IFPRI's impact model, and I'll describe that in a moment. Then we'll look at some policy scenarios and some conclusions. About 15 years ago, with some of my other colleagues, we wrote a paper on the demand-driven livestock revolution in developing countries. And at that point, there had been very little attention paid to what was going on in the livestock sector in developing world. That we pointed out that we were entering a new period of very rapid growth in livestock consumption in the developing world, due not only to population growth, but urbanization, which is transforming diets, moving to higher valued products, among them meat and milk. And also the increasingly rapid income growth in developing countries. We've seen Asia growing for many years, but now sub-Saharan Africa, for example, and parts of the Middle East are also taking off economic in ways that are going to increase meat consumption. So, and I think one point I want to make clear, and I think it also was derived from Mario's talk, is that the livestock sector generates big income opportunities for the rural poor in developing countries. So agriculture in general is really the engine for economic growth in the poorest countries, and livestock is an incredibly important part of that. Of course, cereals used as feeds are going to continue to be an issue, but something that obviously is going to happen. We project about 60%, for example, of future corn growth will be fed to animals. And the kind of growth that we're seeing in demand is I'll point out, does stretch the capacities of existing production and distribution system, leading quite likely to higher prices in the sector. We've heard a lot already about sustainability. I touch also on the impact of climate change. As Mario pointed out, there's a lot more work has been done to look at the impact of climate change on crop agriculture. And there's a wide range of studies, including some of our own, that shows it's very likely that cereal crop yields in 2050 will be anywhere from 10 to 20 or 25% lower than would be the case without climate change. So even factoring in growth, of course, from technology and other investments, but relative to the technological change you would expect, you're going to get a very significant drop in grain productivity. Of course, that's going to tend to raise the prices of feed ingredients, particularly soybeans and corn. There's been a bit of a slowing of production growth also in the crop side, but also on the livestock side in much of the world over the past decade or 15 years. And we'll have to see how that plays out as well. Environmental concerns have already been touched on, greenhouse gas emissions, deforestation. And deforestation, given the technological possibilities that we've seen in greenhouse gas emissions, may end up being the biggest problem that has to be avoided through greater productivity of the existing livestock stock rather than expanding into forests. pollution of surface and groundwater, soil compaction, erosion, loss of fertility in pasture areas, for example. And of course, as I mentioned, the considerable new pressure on land for feed grain, and of course for corn as biofuels, which I think will continue at least for another decade or so, depending on how the policies start playing off. So what I want to do is show you some results for the IFPRI's impact model. This is it's a global economic, so-called partial equilibrium model of the agriculture sector. Covers the whole world with 120 countries and regions that cover the world, and also with sub-regions in many of the countries as well to get at more details. We use it in studies and look at different rates of investment in agriculture research, including livestock research, leading to improvements in technology, food policies, alternative population income growth, and from that, develop long-term estimates of food supply, demand, world prices, and food security. And what I'm going to show here are the baseline projections for livestock demand, supply, prices, and trade. And these represent our, so the baseline represents our best estimates of these various factors drawn from a number of sources of the variables like population, income growth, and long-term technology growth. Skip that one. So let me start here. The first slide is looking at historical trends, in each case starting from 1980, and then looking out to 2050 on the projection side. The top two panels are demand for meat, just divided into developed countries in the blue and developing in the, I guess, yellow color, and on the right-hand side is milk. And so the first thing to note, obviously, is all the growth and demand in the future is going to come from developing countries. So that's where the markets are going to be. There may be a very slight increase in developed countries at the bottom, but nothing to talk about. The bottom panels break those two into major regions of the world. I'll just point out a couple. On the meat side on the left, you see that the bottom blue section is East Asia and the Pacific, which is, of course, dominated by China, but also shows very rapid growth in Southeast Asia that accounts for a huge portion of current and future demand. An interesting change in trend is the second segment from the top. You see sort of a brownish color there is sub-Saharan Africa. As you can see, that goes from barely visible in 2010 to a very substantial, more than 100 million metric tons meat demand by 2050. That's going to be a huge growing market for meat in the future. Similar kinds of trends, but maybe not as dramatic, are seen on the milk side, though here you see the third band from the top is South Asia, and we project continued rapid growth in milk demand in South Asia, including, of course, predominantly India, and you get solid growth in most of the other regions of the world also. Let's break that down into per capita demand, so factoring out the population growth part of it. As you can see, again, at the top is total meat consumption or demand, historical and projected. You see between 2010 and 2050, you get some small growth in developed countries in per capita demand. Part of that is still in the United States. We'll see in a minute through rapidly continued increases in poultry demand, but the developing countries you see are starting at a much lower level, but proportionally are going to grow a lot more as well. Sub-Saharan Africa, for example, is going to more than triple per capita demand between now and 2050. Milk consumption and demand, again, you see only very small increases in per capita demand in the developed world, and very rapid increases in the developing worlds. And one interesting factor is, 5 years ago, people were still saying that Chinese are lactose intolerant. You're never going to get increases in milk consumption there. You're now into a period of very rapid growth of milk consumption in China, and that's one of the things driving that total. Let's look at the U.S. itself, and here's our projections by individual meat commodities. As you see, beef and pork, we're basically saying demand in the long run is going to be stagnant or slightly declining. And while poultry consumption is going to increase over time. baseline projections of just supply. I can go fairly easy on this because fairly light on this because they do mirror to some extent the demand factors. But you can see here now the large, the bigger blue area again is North America, primarily, the light blue kind of in the middle section is North America, primarily United States. So we do still see solid growth in North America and the U.S. Other areas are growing relatively less. You get some growth in sub-Saharan Africa and more growth at the top in Western Europe as well. And let's look how the production again plays out for the U.S. itself. We still see solid growth in milk production. From 2010, we had an average about 85 million metric tons up to almost 100. Meat production increases by almost 50%. And as you can see at the top, that's a large share of it is going to be increases in poultry production. The next most rapid growth, at least in our assessments, is going to be in pork, with beef growing only very little in the coming years. These supply and demand, how they work out in terms of prices, probably the easiest one to look at is the bottom graph. This is world prices projected compared to 2010. And these show potentially, in a sense, very good news for U.S. farmers, very bad news for the low-income consumers of meat that we mainly deal with at IFPRI in developing countries. As you can see, poultry and pork, we're projecting right now nearly a 50% increase in real prices over time, whereas beef has about 20% increase and milk about 15%. This, of course, is a baseline, and we also do some scenarios where we look at what kind of investments in productivity growth and efficiency, how those can change some. But what this indicates, again, is with this kind of business as usual approach that Mario had also mentioned, we're not going to really be able to feed people well. Obviously, it's a tautology. You're going to feed the people who are on the earth, but it's going to be a very low level at very high prices for the poor and developing countries. The trends also that I showed factor into changes in the pattern of trade in the future. And here you can see, this is net trade that I'm showing. So this is exports minus imports. So the negative figures show imports. And I'm looking here in this table at developing countries. In the top is meat and milk in total. As you can see, we're projecting large increases in net trade or net imports into developing countries of meat. So again, that reflects the point that was made earlier. In addition, you can see that most of that imports is going to be, as you can look at the bottom graph, is going to be pork and poultry, which are the commodities where demand is growing the fastest. This represents a significant opportunity for the U.S. industry. And our projections, again, are showing on the meat side, at least, that we see significant increases in exports in the U.S., up to like 13 million tons a year. Of course, this is, again, net of imports. And milk, though, we're showing staying in a net import status. In the bottom graph, again, splitting it into pork and poultry and beef, you see that the export potential that we show is in the pork and poultry areas where there's somewhat more rapid growth in production. So even though we see significant growth in consumption in poultry, we're projecting that the growth in production in the U.S. will outstrip that. Let me just bring up a few of the summary and conclusions here. We find, of course, that this demand-driven livestock revolution is continuing, even maybe faster than we had thought when we first looked at it a few years ago. The rapid growth, as I noted, is in the developing country, but the environmental trade-offs need to be reduced. And one of the key areas is increased investment in livestock research for technology and productivity investment to shift the productivity growth upward. In terms of the impact on nutrition and food security, the increase in consumption in the developing world, despite the fact of higher prices, of course, is a good thing, I think, and that's something that we have had to deal with also, like Mario said, in the international world of all the critics who say meat is bad, you shouldn't have increased consumption of meat. But the fact is that at the low levels of consumption, in sub-Saharan Africa, the average consumption of meat is something like between 2 and 4 kilograms per year per capita. At those levels, you get very significant improvements in nutrition. We saw, again, a great slide earlier. That with increased protein consumption and micronutrient consumption, that meat is the ideal delivery system in these countries, better than biofortification or direct fortification. So it's a really good thing that you're getting meat consumption growth in the developing world. So it has significant nutritional benefits, the highest in Africa, but also in much of Asia, outside of China, where consumption is very low. A number of things have to be done in terms of improving the sustainability of production. Of course, many of you all know better than I do on the management practice side, optimizing diets, improving feed digestibility, also water management, high quality grain concentrates, and improved pasture quality. Technologies, of course, there's waste management, use of byproducts for energy production, as well as recycling, and more integrated management of mixed livestock crop systems. The mixed systems are taking over in much of Africa and need considerable improvement in management. You also need a lot of more investment in genetic resource improvement, including drought and heat tolerance as climate change moves onward. And of course, better conversion of feed to meat and milk, and there's a lot that can be done, particularly in the developing world, on this. As well as crop breeding to provide feed stocks at a lower price. There's also policies that have to be put in place. And one of the key areas is investment in rural infrastructure in the developing world. Rural roads and processing plants invested in public-private partnerships in many cases are essential to link farmers to markets to where they get higher prices for their outputs and lower prices for their inputs, and lower loss of meat and grains in the value chain. So, and we've done a couple papers showing that very heavy levels of infrastructure investment are needed, particularly in Africa, but also in many parts of Asia and some parts of Latin America to break through some of the constraints on livestock and cereal production. Markets and policies are also going to be very important. We've talked a lot already about greenhouse gas reductions. It's going to be very difficult to convince farmers and livestock producers to do much about their greenhouse gas emissions as long as there's no value to carbon. They get no benefit from reducing greenhouse gas emissions, so why should they bother? The same is true of water. Water is wasted in much of the world because it's virtually costless. There's no charge for the water that's used on crops or in livestock production. So until we either develop increased water prices or water markets that can then value water so that farmers can gain by reducing water consumption, you're also very unlikely to get progress there. The same applies to waste management, where either effluent taxes or more effective regulation is going to be needed. Thank you.